I am delighted to welcome on our next session, which is also coming to us from across the globe, my dear friend Angela Ellard, the Deputy Director General of the WTO, coming to us from Geneva. Ask her to turn on her camera, please, and Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, the former Deputy Director General and Deputy USTR, who is coming to us from Colorado, and who today announced news that he is joining our good friends at McLarty and Associates as a senior advisor. Congratulations, Rufus, on your new gig. You are joining an amazing team there, and really excited to know that you'll still be part of the community there. Both of you have been great friends to me personally, staunch supporters of WITA over the years. I was going to say the WTO, and the whole trade community is incredibly grateful to both of you for your years of service and support for global trade. However, before I turn this over to Rufus to moderate our discussion with Angela, I want to welcome several friends of Angela and Rufus who are in the audience today. Steve Lamar, the president of the American Apparel and Footwear Association and president of WITA's board of directors, Deborah Wagoner of Corning, Lisa Schroeder with Dow, and Nassim Fussell with Holland and Knight. Welcome, Steve, Deborah, Lisa, and Nassim, and welcome Angela and Rufus. Rufus, great to see you, and great to see your place in Colorado. I don't think we've had you on WITA Zooms a lot, but never from that location.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and thanks for mentioning my new affiliation. I'm looking forward to working with a great team at McLarty and Associates. And Angela, I want to, on behalf of WITA, welcome you back for another session. I know you've been a very frequent guest of WITA in your prior capacity over the years, great friend of the organization. But it's great to have an entire segment to devote to a conversation with you. We want it to be a kind of an armchair discussion, a little bit of back and forth. We want to focus on your exciting new role in the WTO in Geneva. You know, I guess I want to start by saying I really can't think of any person who has had a longer and more enduring and more pivotal role in US trade policy and trade law formulation over nearly 3 decades now, as the key person in the House of Representatives building a lot of US trade policy. And now here you are in a new capacity. I wanted to start before we get into some discussion of specific issues that you're working on and of the WTO itself. Maybe start by just asking you to reflect a little bit on this transition. You've been there, now, since June, I think. The transition from, a congressional official serving in the US governmental system to an international civil servant. How are you finding your new role at this important organization? And what is it you'd like our audience to know about the importance of the WTO, the existing systems, setting aside for a moment where it goes in the future, but just the importance of the existing regime to US interests and also to global trade and global stability?
Well, thank you very much, Rufus. It is great to be here with you, with Ken, Diego, all of my friends in the audience. I was looking at the list of RSVPs, and I miss you all. I really do. Come visit me. And congratulations, Rufus, on your new position. That's very exciting news.
Thank you.
So one of the biggest things I've learned here is that Rufus has left very big shoes to fill. I'm learning a lot from your experience, Rufus, and we've had many discussions that I really appreciate. But you've really left your mark on this organization for the better, and deeply, deeply grateful for that. So what are the biggest changes for me? I would say that in many ways, working here at the WTO is rather similar to working on the Hill, in that you have, and you would know this from your time on the Hill, very diverse interests that you're representing, that you're advising, and that you are trying to bring together sometimes, very diverse views. But obviously, it's a lot different here. I'm no longer a U.S. official. I have left my official passport behind. I am now an international civil servant, so I don't speak for any government. And the other thing that I've found very interesting is that I also, of course, don't speak for the WTO. All I can do is help try to bring members together. And you know this well. You mastered that art during your time here at the WTO, and you made that transition as well from U.S. ambassador to deputy director general. So it's definitely a challenge. Working though with such a diverse group of members, working with a highly professional staff secretariat here really has made it an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I want to endorse what you said. You know, in many ways, the U.S. Congress is maybe the best training for multilateral negotiating because you really do get into the nitty gritty, and which you did so well over so many years. So, you know, if you don't mind, let's jump into a couple of the things you're working on, a couple of the issues. And I thought if it's okay with you, we may divide it a little bit into things you're working on that are part of the current agenda, and then maybe kind of looking at the future and possible, you know, development of a new reform agenda or new agenda items for the system. But starting with the current, I mean, where do you see things now on some of these current issues? I know you're working that you're very involved in the fisheries subsidies issue, which I think you're responsible for in the Secretariat. And then, of course, there are a number of issues after that you might want to talk about. What is going on pandemic response issues? I know there's some work on quite controversial discussions on TRIPS issues related to that. Maybe looking at these JSI discussions, particularly. I mean, a lot of our audience are obviously interested in the e-commerce part of this, but other issues as well, and how you see the prospects for all of these issues. And by the way, MC12, which, you know, obviously has been disrupted by the pandemic, and which I guess I don't know if you actually have a date scheduled, but maybe you could talk about that too.
Sure. Maybe what I can do is touch on each of those issues, and then we can dig deeper if you would like, or if the audience would like, because
Sure.
there's just so much meat there. Well, first of all, MC12, because that was supposed to happen at the end of November, beginning of December. And we unfortunately had to postpone it because that was right at the time that Omicron was identified, and it was very difficult to travel, in fact, impossible to travel from some areas. And we weren't going to be able to have the ministerial that we needed to have. So we postponed it. A date has not been set specifically, but there is, I think, a lot of member interest in resuming as soon as possible. But I think we're really going to have to be creative about how we go about doing that. What we're doing right now is trying to maintain the momentum on all of these negotiations that were ongoing, whether it was fish, response to the pandemic and intellectual property, agriculture, reform, all of those issues. We've really been trying to maintain the momentum, and I think members have shown a lot of interest in doing that. We've had many meetings now in the 2 months since MC12 was postponed to try to address some of these issues. And we've also made progress on many things, on the environment with some new initiatives, on gender with a new initiative, and on, of course, the JSI with respect to domestic regulation. So we've been able to harness that. We've been able to harvest that, all of those. So we certainly haven't been standing still. But in the meantime, you know, we want to continue. We want to conclude our work on a lot of these very important topics. Fish is near and dear to my heart. Where we're working on how to address fisheries subsidies multilaterally, which is a very important negotiation from an environmental perspective, and from an economic perspective, as well as from a humanitarian perspective. So many people around the world, of course, their livelihoods are dependent on fishing. And for so many people, their source of protein is fish. And being able to source that, being able to purchase that at low cost is so important. But it's also an environmental issue. The extent of overfishing has grown dramatically. It was only about 10% in 1974. And as of today, it's something like 50%. It's really become an acute problem, and it's one that will compound and get worse if we don't do something about it. So the desire, I think, from our members is to be as ambitious as possible, to try to establish disciplines in a way that's workable, and also to deal with the important issue of special and differential treatment for developing countries and the types of obligations that they will face, notification requirements. That is the subject of much heated negotiation. So then we also have the response to the pandemic.
Angela, just before on the
Yeah.
pandemic, just one question on fish, because a lot of people are seeing this. It's been going on a long time, and a lot of people are seeing it to some extent as a test of sort of the WTO's ability to find progress. And do you have any reaction to those comments? Is this a test of the members' ability to come together on an important environmental issue like this that has trade implications?
Well, yes, it is an important measure in the sense that this is a multilateral negotiation with our members representing many diverse views. And the process of negotiation here is, I think it's important to show that we can do this. Now, I would also say that the fish negotiation has a lot of unique elements about it. Some things may be easier to negotiate, other things may be even harder. But there's a reason why this negotiation has been ongoing for 21 years. And I think there is an eagerness among many of our members to bring it to a head, not just for the fish, but to show that this is something that the WTO can do.
Yeah. Okay. Go on. You were starting on pandemic, so I didn't mean to disrupt your train of thought.
On the pandemic. A lot of very important work being done here at the WTO on the pandemic, and two different types of issues. One set of issues relating to intellectual property, in particular, the request by India and South Africa for a waiver of intellectual property rights for products that are used for therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. And then how that is emerging, that negotiation is a difficult one. The topics are rather controversial. The points of view can be quite different, but I think there is a good, healthy discussion that's going on among the key players here. A discussion in which we hope to find consensus that we can then bring to the larger membership for their consideration and input as well. In addition to the intellectual property issues and that work stream, there's also a considerable amount of work being done on the response to the pandemic from a trade policy and supply chain perspective. So this is really the nuts and bolts of how do these products get traded? What are the barriers? What are the bottlenecks to that trade, both in terms of government policies, but also limitations by the private sector that the private sector is experiencing. So at the Secretariat, we've been trying to bring to decision makers, whether in government or in the private sector, information about supply chains in this area. So mapping out, for example, the various means of trade, also trying to identify, for example, all of the products that are used to produce a vaccine, so that countries know when they impose certain barriers, or if they have tariffs or other types of customs barriers or red tape, what kind of impact that has in terms of vaccine production. But the idea too, through this effort, the Secretariat effort, as well as what we call the Walker process, named after Ambassador David Walker from New Zealand, who until he retired in December, was trying to pull together a package of issues for members to consider. This is something that shows members what their policy choices are. It covers everything from trade facilitation on the positive side, what the effect of trade facilitation would be, to barriers like export restraints on the other side. And it's, I think, really brought a lot of very practical information to the table for members to consider if they really want to get at the practical aspects of this. So it's been a very healthy discussion. The members don't always see eye to eye on what the role of the WTO should be here. But it has, I think, put a lot of issues on the table. Isn't
part of the role, how do you create a cooperative framework for dealing with pandemics and their effects that helps keep trade open to the greatest extent possible instead of countries going their own way? I saw one analyst who put it in a pretty dramatic way. He said, an unhealthy world will trade less.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, because there is certainly a need for cooperation, for global cooperation. The pandemic has made this clear. Very few countries can go it alone, and in some cases, no country or no WTO member can go it alone on particular products. When you look at vaccines, for example, there are some 280 elements that go into the making of a vaccine. It's very hard to produce every single one of those in a resilient, redundant way that allows you to address any lapses in the supply chain if you're doing it all at home. So, we've certainly seen natural disasters in the US, for example, that have really had an effect on the supply chain. We've seen this elsewhere as well. It's not just in the US. But the pandemic, natural disasters, other type, a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, all of these things have an effect on supply chains. And, I think it becomes a policy choice for decision makers as to, there's I think a lot of temptation to bring everything back home, to reshore it and become completely independent. But the question is whether you can really do that. And to the extent that it's difficult to do that, we need more communication, more coherence, more resilience, more working with like-minded WTO members to try to make those supply chains work from a commercial perspective, but also in taking policy steps that don't create even more bottlenecks.
Yeah, that's a great insight into how just what happens if supply chains don't remain resilient and working in the world, and how everybody will suffer from it. I wonder if we could turn to some of the future discussion now, Angela, unless you had more you wanted to say on current issues.
No, I think that those are let's talk about the future.
Okay, obviously, there's an awful lot of talk, not just in the US, but around the world, about a future reform agenda. It's such a massive collection of potential issues that I hardly know where to begin, because lots of members in the WTO have lots of different views about how to shape this agenda. And obviously that'll be one of your big problems, is how do you bring people together to get negotiations launched. But you know, the WTO's got a pretty good success record on many of those things. You just mentioned about domestic regulation, but you know, obviously a trade facilitation agreement in the midst of a period when people thought the WTO was not working very well. But you know, maybe you want to talk a bit about those challenges of bringing people together where they are maybe in direct conflict on some of these. And I don't know which ones you want to talk about, because obviously there's a potential future agenda on the environment, as you heard from that previous panel about what is the role of the WTO on issues like carbon and other environmental issues. Industrial subsidies, I know you're, as the deputy in charge of the rules process in the WTO, I know you're looking at that very closely. You mentioned already a lot of the supply chain issues, but are there others on health and supply chain? And of course, we can't forget whatever you want to say about DSU reform and what the prospects are for that. So, so the floor is open for you to talk about as many of those as you want.
Well, it's a pretty broad menu, which is exciting. Many different types of issues, something for everyone. Let me start with WTO reform, because that is something that's very near and dear to the Director General's heart, and of course to our members in the WTO as well. Everybody talks about the need for reform. I think that's indisputable. But at the same time, the question is, what does that mean? What is reform? I think that the general idea is that we need reform on the three pillars that make up the WTO: the negotiating pillar, the monitoring pillar, and the dispute settlement pillar. That all of these need some work in some way. And this is maybe where I can bring in some of the other issues that you mentioned. So let's start with dispute settlement. As you know, the appellate body is no longer functioning. The United States had blocked the movement of new appellate body members. So the appellate body does not have a quorum. So there's a lot of discussion about what should that look like? What should reform look like with respect to dispute settlement? And I think a lot of ideas that are starting to shape up right now. But there's still a lot of discussion that needs to happen. A consensus really about what the problem is and how do we go about fixing that. But I'm happy to report that in the meantime, the dispute settlement system in the WTO is still working. Yes, there have been cases appealed into the void because there's no appellate body, but the panel process is still being used. We have new cases brought all the time. We also have a means to resolve those cases where we have, for example, in some cases, a facilitator who has tried to bring the parties together, or the parties may decide that they don't need to appeal, as the United States recently did in the olives case involving the EU. We also have compliance, the most effective way of resolving a dispute in many ways, and that happens as well. So there are all different kinds of methods that are used. I think members are being quite creative, and that gives me a lot of hope that we can reach an understanding with respect to dispute settlement. On the other two pillars, on the monitoring pillar, there's a fair amount of discussion about the need for more transparency. Our reviews, the trade policy reviews that we undertake periodically for all of our members have really been quite successful. We had one last year, late last year for China, another for Russia, for Korea. We have one for the United States coming up later this year. These are really important opportunities for WTO members to communicate their concerns, to ask questions, but it's all based on transparency, notifications, and making sure that there is information about what countries are doing. So there's definitely been a call for more of that. And then the final pillar, or some would say the first pillar, which is the negotiating pillar. And there, a lot of the topics that you talked about are things that are being actively discussed. So the panel right before us spoke about creative ways to deal with the environment and how the WTO is particularly well suited to address some of these issues. It's made some progress with respect to 3 initiatives, but in addition to that, the question is what comes next. In the last panel, there was some discussion about climate change and a carbon pricing mechanism. The fact that there has been such a proliferation of carbon pricing all over the world. We have something like 70 different carbon prices and covering a relatively small percentage of trade. The WTO, it seems to me, is an ideal place to try to work on these issues multilaterally, because we have members, 164 members from all over the world, all different levels of economic development, who are involved in different levels of industrial, agriculture, manufacturing capacity. And I think we would have everybody at the table if we were to do this at the WTO, to try to find some kind of mechanism on carbon pricing. It's so much better to deal with issues like this through negotiation, as opposed to trying to set policy by litigation, which would be really not a constructive, coherent way of addressing the issue. It would help us.
In fact, isn't the WTO really compelled to deal with this issue? Because if not, you're going to have conflict between existing rules and these new regimes if you don't sort of address fundamental issues like MFN and national treatment and how a carbon pricing system fits within that kind of global regime of existing trade rules.
Right. A negotiation gives you a sense of the full picture. Litigation is very piecemeal, and it depends on the cases that are brought. And so you end up with decisions that may or may not be applicable across a broad spectrum of policies. And it creates confusion, uncertainty, makes it very hard for, I think, for countries to comply with their obligations and for business to know what it's supposed to do. And then, of course, ultimately, in terms of climate change, it's not a very effective, doing this through litigation is not an effective way of addressing the problem of climate change.
Yeah.
So in terms of some of the other things that you mentioned.
Well, I was particularly interested in industrial subsidies. I know that's a difficult issue to discuss, but I think a lot of our members would be interested in sort of what your preliminary views anyway are of a potential negotiation in that sector.
Right. Well, subsidies is something where there's been a lot of focus by members coming at it from different perspectives. Industrial subsidies, agriculture subsidies, fiscal stimulus type programs. We hear our members talking about all of those in the context of trying to learn more about what the universe is, what the lay of the land is. So we are working with other international organizations, including the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, to try to map out what it is that's out there, trying to get the facts. That's really the first step before you can have any type of discussion or any type of scoping out what these issues are and what the implications are. So that's our first effort, well underway. And we hope will really contribute to the dialogue. But I would add, when it comes to something like subsidies, just like any other topic, we are a member-driven organization. I've been learning this. It's told to me at least once a day by some member saying that, the the Secretariat only has so much that it can do. We are a
Mhm.
member-driven organization. So that's fine. That's the way we're set up. But what that means is members have to decide how it is they want to tackle issues like this and whether they want to tackle issues like this. But I do think that this is an area where, again, the WTO, with its global focus, its multilateral focus, bringing members from all levels of development to the table, this is an ideal place, I think, to have that discussion. But ultimately, it's up to members to figure out what the parameters are going to be.
Angela, I wanted to ask you a kind of a sort of general overarching question, and then we can get to Ken. I'm sure Ken's collecting some questions from the audience and we should go to them, but I want to ask you an overarching question that really relates to all of this, not just the present agenda, but certainly where the WTO will go in the future. You know, there's an awful lot of people who are questioning the credibility of the WTO as a place to resolve differences among the major players, given what's happened over the last certainly 4 or 5 years, whether those divisions, which go so much to the heart of kind of their own economic systems and how WTO might impact their systems, or put another way, how their systems might impact WTO rules and disciplines. And, you know, some people think this presents an insurmountable challenge. I know it's a sensitive thing for you to answer because I'm not asking you to address any specific country or its economic system, but just as a general observation, how serious do you think that is? And can the members find ways of overcoming what sometimes seem like insurmountable challenges to find solutions to some of these issues in the future?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Rufus. It's hard to answer that. I think that we definitely have different systems here, different economic systems, and different levels of economic development.
Yeah.
And that really affects how different members come to the table and what their goals are. I think that it's important for members to understand the perspective of the other members around the table. Sometimes, you know, you hear a member talk about a particular issue. Well, why can't these others, you know, do what I want? Don't they care about the system? And I think everyone cares about the system. That's why they're here. That's why they send their best to Geneva. I think that the problem is that although they have a stake, they just look at different economies, look at it differently. And I think that's the challenge, but it's not insurmountable as long as the members are coming to the table in good faith and are willing to figure things out. Now, when you talk about an issue like subsidies, no, that's not going to be something that we can resolve overnight. But there are ways to, I think, start to peel away the layers of the onion and to try to figure out how to address some of the problems that we're facing. So we're doing this with respect to the pandemic, for example. We're doing it on fish subsidies as well, you know, where you have major players who have been heavy subsidizers historically. You have other players who have become large players, but they don't subsidize. And then you have countries that have never subsidized and also really don't fish very much beyond the you know, kind of an artisanal type fishing, but want to be able to do more. And I think we were making some progress. We've been making some progress on fish subsidies as we get into these groups where members can really talk to each other, and sometimes you see the light go off. Oh yeah, I understand now where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this and say if we all just get along, we could make so much
Right.
progress, but it's hard. It really is an enormous challenge.
But,
But I think there's an effort to try.
yeah, and I agree with
And
you.
I don't know where else we can do that except
Right.
here.
Exactly. I mean, things always look insurmountable going forward. I remember way back in the dim, dark early days of the Uruguay round when people said it would be impossible for the US and Europe to reach an agreement on issues like trips and services with countries like Brazil and India. And, obviously, maybe nothing is impossible is a good motto for the WTO as well as for others. But Angela, I do want to, we're going to turn it back over to Ken. Before we do, I want to just say how, impressed I am by not only your grasp of this whole system very quickly in your new job, but, the dynamism with which this new team is taking over. I should mention, you mentioned gender issues. I want to point out that, the very first senior woman on the WTO leadership team was my colleague, Valentin Ruguabiza. She was the only one at the time, and now 3 of the 5 top leadership positions in the WTO are women. So, and I know you as a strong advocate of gender issues. That's a great sort of thing for people to recognize about the new system. I want to thank you again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I can't wait to come and see you in person, along with, I'm sure, many other WITA members who can't wait to be back into the practice of coming over and seeing how things are going to Geneva. I'm going to turn it over to Ken now, and thanks a lot, Angela. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Rufus. Just such a delight to see you. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere, Rufus. We got a couple questions for Angela before you sign off. Angela, thanks so much. As Rufus said, it's always a pleasure to welcome you to the WITA stage. You've been here so many years in person. We've scheduled our 2022 Congressional Trade Agenda event for March 11th. And you and I have done together every year since 1999.
Yep.
And it'll be the first time it's ever been done without you on the stage. So
I'm sure you'll survive. You will thrive.
We'll be fine, but we miss you. So really a pleasure to have you on. We did have a few questions come in. I'm just going to lump a couple of the themes together, maybe just to help wrap some things up. One was just any thoughts on the subsidy case that was announced, the arbitrator's approval that China can retaliate against U.S. subsidies. What does this say about the subsidies disciplines? I know you've got into it a little bit, but just if there's thoughts you want to share on what that might mean for next steps related to that decision, and if there's some changes that may need to be made to subsidies rules. That was one question. Another question came in about, is there a role for the WTO with regional trade agreements in the absence and disputes? I'm not quite sure how that one fits together. OECD Secretary General was on earlier, talked about their primacy in dealing with carbon border adjustment issues. You see that as an area that the WTO should be taking a more active leadership role on, or is taking a leadership role on. And I think those are the main ones that we have that have come in. But just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on any of those issues.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken.
And there's lastly, one on India and exporting pharma drugs for profit with the whole the waiver issues that have come up.
Okay. Well, this is a pretty broad range of things.
So throwing it all out there for you before we turn to our
I promise I'll take no more than 30 minutes.
Two.
I have 2. Okay.
I'll give you 3.
For some of these questions, I'm glad I only have 2.
I know.
On the question on the subsidy case that China is now authorized to retaliate. Obviously, our system here has this the mechanism for an arbitrator to decide on the amount of the retaliation. It was hard fought on both sides, and the arbitrator made a decision. At this point, it's up to the parties to decide where they want to take it and how they want to take it. What China decides to do, if it will, in fact, step forward. The United States has, also some say here too. So, it's really up to the parties. The process here has, we've gone through the full process up to the point of retaliation. Of course, compliance is always an option. I'm just speaking legally, not politically, because that's a whole nother question, but I'm just answering this question from a legal perspective, that it is, that's where it stands. So it's up to the parties. As to the OECD and carbon pricing, the OECD is a very strong collaborator with the WTO, and we work very, very well with other international organizations. And I think there's plenty of room for everyone to tackle such an important issue like this, and getting facts on the ground is very important as well. I do think that the WTO brings a unique global perspective. We have 164 members, and we have 20 more who are seeking to join. So that's not quite everybody, but pretty much everyone. And that means everyone's represented, everyone is vested, and would be part of a discussion. So I think it will be very difficult to move forward if on something like this, if it's not global. It's an issue of the global commons. On the question about the role of the WTO in RTAs, regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, the WTO does have a role in that under the WTO system, under our rules, FTAs, RTAs must cover substantially all trade. And I think that's really disciplined the whole notion of negotiating these types of agreements, which after all are exceptions from the most favored nation rule, which is so fundamental to the WTO. But I do think that, in terms of the role of multilateralism, that will always be, I think, paramount. And in fact, despite the proliferation of regional trade agreements, more than 75% of global trade is on an MFN basis. So that means that it's always going to be important. And we also have a growing network of plurilateral negotiations as well under the auspices of the WTO. And we hope that those will be multilateralized at some point, but it is an opportunity to make great progress on issues that are very important to members. And then finally, on the question of drugs, members are negotiating this very hard, I think, to try to see how we can assure access to medicines, critical medicines that are needed for the pandemic, and at the same time maintain incentives for innovation. And that's really the challenge that we're facing. We obviously want to create a situation that rewards intellectual property, but that at the same time, we need to deal with the tremendous vaccine inequity that exists, and making sure that not only are products that are so essential manufactured all around the world, but that they're actually distributed as well and get to the people all around the world that need them. Because one thing we learned from Omicron is that just when we thought in the US and Europe and other places that things were looking okay, not so much, right? So this is the challenge we're going to face until we broaden this out and until we get more people vaccinated all over the world.
Thank you for that. I often say at the end of a lot of our sessions, I hope everyone who has access to the vaccine gets it as soon as they can. So thank you for saying that. I'll continue to echo it here. Thank you, Angela. It's always just a pleasure to have you on. Welcome you in person when we're live again in person in DC again, to have you on screen. It's great to see you. We look forward to visiting as well. Rufus, thanks again. Congrats on your new gig. Look forward to keeping you on this, seeing more of you and seeing you on screen or in person here in DC. So thank you very much. We're going to go to our next panel. Really grateful to have you, Angela, Rufus. Thank you.